I imagine that when our dear member Nora was asked to talk about her life in a summer service, I wasn't there, but I imagine that she gave a big sigh and said, "How long have I got?" And she was told, well, 20 minutes would be about the right length. She probably gave another big sigh and said, okay. Nora grew up in peaceful, pre-war Estonia, and then experienced the dark war years, and then came to Canada after the war. Her journey brought her eventually to North Shore Unitarian Universalism, and countless hours volunteering as chair of the library committee, among other things. And we promised not to hold her to the 20 minutes. We got a bit extra, I'm sure. But please join me in welcoming Nora in her talk called 85 Years in 20 Minutes.
Before I even start, I want to mention I put a few old photographs on the lobby table out there in case you want to have a look at some of my family and where I came from. I was born in Tallinn, and Estonia was a small country of only 1 million people in between the two world wars, and that was the only time it was ever independent, from 1990 to 40, and then after the Russian Empire collapsed. Then 50 years of Russian Ice Age, like my cousins were saying, and so it finally is free again now. In the 1750s, there was a British naval patrol ship in the Baltic Sea, and on board was a Scottish sailor by the name of Grant. He jumped ship and settled on the Estonian coast. So I have some Scottish blood in me. My grandfather, Jacob Markson, was a builder of windmills in the interior of the country, came to the coast looking for work. Nobody was building windmills, they were all building ships. So he became an apprentice shipbuilder with Captain Grant and worked for him, learned the trade, married his daughter, built her a house in 1889. It's a lovely big old house, painted blue like all the other captains' houses in the village, which is now a museum, actually. And he went into direct competition with his father-in-law. So Markson ended up with a fleet of 16 cargo ships. That was before the age of steam, and Grant only had 12. They said Markson became so rich that the story goes he kept his Russian gold rubles in a dresser drawer and counted his money with a measuring cup. He was a very religious man. They were all Lutherans. So he had an itinerant minister come to this best parlor every Sunday and give Sunday services for the family and staff. There was a big organ in the living room, until all the shipbuilders and captains got together, pooled their money, and built a lovely granite church in the next village. So my father, his son Alexander, studied electrical engineering at the University Nancy, France. So my family was always very impressed by the French culture. And he became director of the electric power station in Tallinn. My grandfather, Karman, my mother's father, was also a self-made man. He grew up on the country estate of a Baltic German nobleman and was tutored together with the nobleman's son, so he had a good education. And when he was an adult, he came to Tallinn to seek his fortune. Went to work for a grocer, married the daughter, and took over the business. Which grew and grew because he ended up with 4 stores and 3 or more houses in the downtown core of Old Tallinn. Now Tallinn is a UNESCO World Heritage Site now, so it's very historic and beautiful. Alexander married Ellen, and we were lukewarm Lutherans. We only went to church on Christmas, really. And my sister and I attended a private French school. So there we sang the Estonian and French anthems at assembly. We had a summer cottage that we all loved dearly and spent as much time as possible out there. But one sunny summer Sunday morning, my father suddenly wanted to emulate his father and said we should both sit there and read the Bible. As on cue, both my sister and I escaped into the garden and hid in the woods. I think I was rebelling already then. In the winter of 1939 and 40, I remember my parents standing by the radio very somberly listening to the news of the Russia and Finnish winter war. And they were shushing me to keep quiet. And a lot of Estonian young men went over the ice to help their Finnish brothers fend off the Russian aggressors. In May 1940 was grandfather Carmen's 75th birthday. It was the last big family celebration we had in peaceful times. And he invited all his business friends for a smorgasbord lunch. It was very intimidating to me because Mother had written a poem for the occasion. I had to pick a bunch of wildflowers, go into that room full of men, curtsy, recite my poem, present the flowers, curtsy again and make a quick exit. The women and children ate in the back room. You probably all remember or have heard of the Ribbentrop-Molotov secret pact between Russia and Germany, where they were carving up Eastern Europe between them without asking the countries affected at all. So in June 1940, Russian troops and tanks marched into Estonia with the slogan, "We came to save and protect you." Does that sound familiar? Putin is still using the same propaganda lines when his troops marched into the Ukraine recently. Some things just never change. The first things they did is confiscate all the banks and bank accounts, deposit boxes, closed the churches, closed the private schools, took all the private businesses away. So I had to go to public school and learn the Russian anthem. So we were fearful. Deportations and genocide had started. Freight trains full of Estonians were taken to Siberia, many of our friends and relatives included, and most of them died there of overwork, starvation, disease, and cold. It was really tough, and we became very afraid. We were threatened. So we were having to search for some kind of German relative in order to get a permit to flee west to Germany. And as luck would have it, there was, in the 1700s, there was a German dramatist and diplomat by the name of August von Kotzebue, who was stationed in Tallinn as a German representative, made an Estonian girl pregnant, who happened to be one of our forebearers. So we had some German blood in us too. And so my parents got the travel permit and we packed quickly, said our sad goodbyes, and left for Germany in March of 42, I guess it was. And I took my piggy bank to the bakery, dumped the contents on the counter and said, "Give me meringues for the whole lot." I ended up with this big bag that I put under the deck chair. We were on a freighter in the hold in rows of deck chairs, and I was there drowning my sorrows with meringues. We were put into a deserted old country estate in north of Germany. It was cold, it was winter, it was dark, the windows were broken. We had to sleep on straw mattresses and endless kitchen duty peeling potatoes to feed all these refugees. Soon Father found a job with an electrical firm in Görlitz, and we moved there and were assigned a brand new apartment. It was empty, and the building was still under construction. I remember standing at the open window and listening as the German foreman was abusing the Polish forced laborers and slapping them about and screaming at them. And the Poles had to wear a purple and yellow diamond sewn onto their clothes with the letter P. And my mother called me away from the window. "Be quiet, don't say anything, close the window." I think I was outspoken already then. So I went to the German school and had to say Heil Hitler and sing the German anthem. And we had food rationing for the first time in our lives. But in August 1941, the Germans liberated the Baltic countries from the Russians, and we thought this was going to be forever. We were anxious to get back home again. Father was able to leave right away and continue with his old job, whereas Mother and Doris, my sister, and I had to go to Berlin to get travel permits. It got very complicated. The Germans loved red tape. Everything had to be duplicated and triplicated, and forms and rubber stamps. And it was a tedious thing, but eventually we got our permits and we traveled as far as Riga by troop train and stayed a week with my father's sister, who had married the Lutheran bishop of Riga, and their daughter Gerda was with them there. We had a week of rest and visit. And on the day that we were headed on for Tallinn, Cousin Gerda said, Father was dead. He had died. I just stood there, numb. I didn't even cry. I was not a very emotional person, I don't think. So, but we carried on a crowded troop train anyway. I remember the soldiers were all chain smoking. And when in Tallinn, Mother found lodging in one of grandfather's old houses right beside City Hall. He had an apartment there. And I went to the German school again, and our hobby there was collecting photographs of German movie stars and trading those, and I went to a lot of movies. Since it was winter, it got very dark very early. Even when I came home from a movie matinee, I remember one afternoon I tripped over a drunken soldier who was sleeping on the sidewalk because you couldn't see anything. It was always blackout. But in March 44, the Russians were advancing again, and they also had an air raid. They were bombing Tallinn with incendiary bombs. Now the old town core was mostly built of stone, was fairly safe, but the outlying districts were all aflame, really. The wooden houses were burning. But also they had hit the tower on the city hall right in front of our house, and the burning cinders were falling into the attic of our building where the roof tiles had been blown off. So my mother and I sat in the vaulted cellar for safety, which had been a jail in the Middle Ages. There were still iron rings in the walls from those days, from the 1500s. Well, my sister, with a bucket of water, was in the attic, putting out the flames, saving our house. Next morning, one of our neighbors from the cottage country came to fetch us with horse and sleigh to take us to safety to our cottage. And the following day, Mother wanted to go and thank them and pay them for doing it, and they were gone. Overnight, they had taken a small motorboat and fled to Sweden, the whole family. A lot of people did that. It was very dangerous because they got shot at both by the Germans and the Russians. But Swedes received them kindly and openly, and a lot of our friends and relatives fled over there that way and ended up in Sweden. After all the dust settled, so to speak, I ended up with the whole family dispersed all over the world, really. Relatives in Germany, Sweden, England, Canada, US, and Australia, wherever they could find a safe haven. We were also given other families to stay with us who were billeted with us because they were homeless after the air raid and stayed with us for a while. But the Germans were retreating, and we felt we needed to head west again eventually. We were nervous, and times were difficult. So again, we had to get travel permits. I forgot to tell the story of the cow. I have to backtrack. And in that summer, the last summer in Estonia, our neighbor came to us and said, I have an illegal, unregistered cow. can you hide the cow for us? And it was a beautiful cow, so we kept her in our dovecote, and I was the cowgirl, and she kept us alive with lots of milk. We made our own butter and cottage cheese. But then the Germans were retreating and things were again difficult. We thought we'll have to flee west for a second time to get away from the Russians, because they were what we were most fearing. And we received our permits and traveled by ship to Germany, and there were air raids. We had to wear life jackets all the time. And we were billeted in a small town, a spa town, and ski resort near the Polish and Czech borders in the mountains. It was a beautiful place, but they put us in a ski cottage 4 kilometers up the mountainside about town. So I had to commute to school by walking every day through the forest. I felt like Heidi. Mother and sister were conscripted to work in a munitions factory, and my school class had to go and mend military hospital bed linen, or go to the potato fields and pick up the potato bugs and squash them. Also, a lot of the young kids in my class were preparing for Lutheran confirmation. And so I wanted to be like everybody else. I joined in and did that too, although Mother was saying, God did not make man, man made God. I remember mulling that one over. The ski hut was full of refugees. There were a lot of families there, apart from the landlady. It was crowded, but it was a land of old people, women, and children. There were no men, because they were all somehow conscripted into the war one way or another. And I never did thank my mother properly to look after us and kept us safe through all those years of hardship. And I never really appreciated it properly at the time. When I suddenly realized that it was too late, she had passed away. Mother's birthday was on May 8th, 1945. You probably all know that was the end of the war, and relief and hope. There was a highway right behind our cottage, and the German soldiers threw down their weapons and were heading west towards home, and the Russian soldiers came along with their equipment, etc., and they were all mingled together. Nobody seemed to care that first day, but it was hot. They were all thirsty. The landlady's daughter and I stood there all day with buckets of water, giving it to the various soldiers to keep them going west and west and west. That was always, the refugees went west and the aggressors went west. Pretty soon after that, the looting and raping began. The soldiers were out of control. And my mother realized she had Russian skills that she had forgotten about. She hadn't used the language since the First World War. But with that, she was able to help. The farmer next door was about to lose one cow that the soldiers were going to slaughter. So Mother managed to rescue that cow with her Russian. And then one of the old ladies in our building, when a soldier waving his machine gun was also pulling the gold earrings out of her earlobes, and Mother managed to stop that just in time. One day, 3 soldiers came in, again cradling their machine guns and smiling with their steel teeth, and herding us all into the common room, and then discussing in Russian amongst themselves as to who should rape whom. And my mother understood that and warned the young women, and so my sister leapt off the balcony and hid in the woods all day. I didn't. I was sent out to bring her back home again late in the evening. So she actually managed to save, many little things. Just once in a while she would rush out onto the highway and flag down a staff car of officers who would then come in and tell the soldiers to get out, that they weren't actually allowed to be looting, but they did. So the ration cards were useless, and winter was coming. There was not much prospect, and prospects were dismal, but the farmer let us clean the grain and potato fields after harvest, and as a special treat she asked me to come in after the evening milking and eat the foam out of her milk separator. We also lived on beech nuts, mushrooms and blueberries. The forest was all around. And I had a note in my diary that we picked 200 liters of blueberries that fall, a lot of which we traded for other foodstuffs like salt and bread and maybe a piece of sausage. We were lucky. So those blueberries kept us alive. One day, Mother went to town with our electric iron to trade it for a loaf of bread. And Sister and I were at the cottage by ourselves. A Russian marched in to our room looking for loot. And we thought we had everything well hidden. The watches were pinned to the backs of the curtains way up high, and each of us had a grandfather's and father's gold watch chains sewn into our garter belts. But Mother had hidden some jewelry behind the night table, and wouldn't you know it, when he grabbed the night table to pull it out, he touched the silver and amethyst pendant of my mother's that was her favorite piece. And I'm not normally an emotional person, but I threw myself at his feet, grabbed his knees, and yelled and screamed and cried and wept and begged. And he actually threw the jewelry on the bed and gave this kind of smile as if he was a wonderful, warm-hearted hero, and left the room. I had won my case. That was my first acting job. So, since there was nothing to look forward to and the situation was very poor, and the Russians had taken over eastern Poland for themselves, and in exchange they gave eastern Germany to the Poles. So the Russians moved out and Polish occupation came. Now they were more cruel and vicious and full of revenge because they'd been treated so badly by the Germans. And so they made us wear white armbands, and they brought in the Polish currency, the zloty, none of which we had. And winter was approaching. Mother went to the nearest county town one day, searching for a way to get west if possible, and ran into a Dutch Red Cross man who was organizing a freight train of refugees headed west the next morning, which was called the Flying Dutchman. Actually, she hurried home, we packed what we could carry, and off we went to catch that train. It was a freight train, absolutely packed with people, completely dark when the doors were shut, a metal milk can in the middle of the cart as a toilet. And quite often, as the train was moving west bit by bit, it would be on a siding, having to wait, for another clear bit of track. And you could hear soldiers marching outside, and suddenly a baby would cry, or one of the people would be sitting noisily on the toilet, and we were all holding our breath in fear of being found out. Twice our leader, this Dutchman, went around the train with a hat in hand, collecting more money and jewelry to bribe the train engineer and the border guards so that we could get across into what was then the Russian zone out of the Polish zone. And once we reached there, the train trip came to an end. We were on our own. We had to go on the regular trains, which were very irregular then, because all schedules were shot. Trains had no glass windows in them. I always had soot in my eye. And railroad stations were bombed out. There were no roofs, so it was always cold and dark and wet, and we were hungry. But we got west, and the trains were terribly crowded with refugees and released soldiers who were all ill and wounded. The Russians kept the well ones in slave labor for a number of years. So when we finally reached the British zone border, we had to walk 10 kilometers through no man's land, and there were the British soldiers, well-dressed, neat and clean and friendly and smiling, greeting us. But the first thing they did was they gave each of us a dose of DDT powder down the backs of our necks in order to avoid lice. And then they loaded us into trucks and took us to a transit camp. And from there, eventually, we were billeted in North Germany in a town called Leer, which means empty, and it really was. We were out amongst turnip and animal feed fields. There wasn't a tree in sight. It was a nice big old house, but the town was miles away from us, very isolated. And it was two old spinster sisters in their 70s who lived there. And they went to church every Sunday with a horse and carriage and coachman and all dressed in black lace, very religious, but then they would say things to us like, we only have enough warmth and food for ourselves. We were in an unheated room with only a mattress on the floor and a desk and a chair. So it was a special treat if they let me go into the kitchen and warm up near the stove. One day Mother wanted to write to the Red Cross. We actually carried a pot of ink with us in all this traveling. It was before ballpoint pens. But she found the ink was frozen. She couldn't write. And do you remember Dr. Zhivago, the movie, when they fled beyond the Urals to their country hideaway, and it was an ice palace all over, but he went to his study, took out paper and pen and ink and wrote a poem? The ink was not frozen. The props person didn't know what they were doing. So eventually Mother wrote to the Red Cross. They had an agency to bring people together because we'd all fled wherever we could. We'd lost touch with friends and relatives. And that way Mother found her father and sister in the American zone in the south. And so, but sister was dying of cancer, so Mother asked for travel permits yet again to go and nurse her sister. And off she went. In the meantime, Doris and I had moved to the town of Detmold, where we found cousin Gerda, who was working for the British military because of her many language skills. And Doris went to work for the British military also because she spoke several languages. And I just hung around till I got my travel permit to join my mother in the American zone. In the meantime, my aunt had died. And we were billeted with a very, very nice landlady where my grandfather was also. It was a peaceful town. It was untouched by war. It was 1,000 years old, very historic and beautiful. I went to a high school there called the Stellar Gymnasium. And only later did I discover that was the birthplace of Stellar, the explorer and naturalist, botanist, I guess we'd call it, who went to work for the Tsars. He came from Bad Windsheim, and our BCJ is called the Stellar's J after him. He named it. So the world is quite small in some ways. And at the high school, I had a good friend. We were always together thinking up schemes. So we wrote the class newspaper, but we were very short of teachers, books, and paper. We had a favorite teacher we all adored. We did our best work for him in physics and mathematics. And when it was his birthday, we each sacrificed a coupon of 25 grams of meat from our 100-gram weekly ration to give him a gift. And one of the girls in my class was a butcher's daughter. We gave the stamps to her, and she was able to get a long chain of sausages that we presented the teacher and made him very happy. But it was a sacrifice. If you only have 100 grams and you give a quarter of that away, because we all loved our teacher. We all belonged to the Lutheran youth group where we did a lot of hiking and singing. We also put on Christmas pageants. And Else was Mary and I was Joseph. So when my sister was, in 1947 already, my sister was able to emigrate to Canada, and she chose Montreal because she spoke French. She went to work for a family in Westmount with a number of children. And so she finished her contract, and by then I was 18. You weren't eligible to emigrate until you were 18, single, healthy, and ready to work, and then the government would pay your passage by ship to come to Montreal. So I took over my sister's job with that family, and the children taught me English around the kitchen table, because when I arrived, my English was very spotty, basic, miserable, high school English. And I didn't have any money, and I had a cardboard suitcase with hand-me-down used clothes from the Red Cross, and that's how I arrived in Canada. And these children in that family really, I was ending up reading bedtime stories to them, and I also went to secretarial course in the evenings. And while Doris had applied at McGill and had scholarships and bursaries, and but had nowhere to live because the people she boarded with were leaving town. So her English professor was a friend of the Simons family, Frank and Betsy Simons, who went to them and said, I have this bright immigrant student in my class, but she has nowhere to live. Any bright ideas? And Mr. and Mrs. Simons said, she can come and live with us. We have a spare room and bathroom for her. So they believed in hands-on helping when needed. So Doris moved in. They were the grandparents of Paul Simons and Joanna Vaughan. So I'm still friends with the family now. And in my job, I took sick from overwork because I guess I wasn't very strong. And the doctor recommended that I have a month rest. Guess what? Again, Mr. and Mrs. Simons leapt to our aid and let me stay in a spare bedroom in their house for a month till I recuperated. And then Mr. Simons gave me a secretarial job in his company office. He also introduced me to a young man called Garth Coates, freshly out from Vancouver to learn the marine insurance and adjusting business. And then he took us both to the Montreal Unitarian Church, where Philip Hewitt was a young assistant minister, fresh out from England for a year. But so Mr. and Mrs. Simons actually gave us gave me my job, my husband, and my religion. Because the Unitarian Church finally was a perfect fit for me. I had found home. And then we saved our pennies. We lived, Garth and I got engaged, got married, and Mr. Simons gave me away at our wedding. So they were role models for us, really, and to open my eyes to culture, taught us about opera and music, symphony and theater and ballet. And that lovely grand piano that is now on the Silk Purse in West Vancouver stood in their living room in Montreal in those days. I remember a lady who was an editor of the local newspaper playing dirty English barroom ditties on it one New Year's Eve. So, Garth and I were living in an apartment, saving our pennies to buy a house in the suburbs like everybody else was doing in those days, and we did that in 1956 and then proceeded to adopt 2 little girls. First, Maris, who was dedicated by Leonard Mason, the then minister at the Montreal Church, and a little later our daughter Gwen, who was dedicated by Fred Cappuccino in our Lakeshore Unitarian Church, which was thriving with Unitarians in those days. So both those girls have brought us a lot of happiness and delight and grandchildren. And I got involved in social action and volunteer jobs while living in Beaurepaire. I was a brownie leader, the Brown Owl, when the girls were the right age for it, and the girlfriend and I started a lending library with donated books in an unused hockey shack. And I also saved a hill from developers. That was the only little ski and toboggan hill in the area, called Apple Hill, but the realtors were salivating to cover it with real estate. But we fought them. And I remember there were 2 gentlemen on the committee, and I carried a message from Mr. Hopgood to Mr. Lightfoot, which I thought was quite interesting. But we won our case. It is still a park there and for the children to enjoy in perpetuity. I also joined a group called STOP, a women's group, Society to Overcome Pollution. And we set up our first recycling depot in 1970 in the shopping mall near where we lived, and it was a huge success. Actually, we were novices at this. I mean, people were bringing stuff in, and we had to have it removed, so we got a truck to come with prison laborers, but we also called the newspapers for publicity photos, and the laborers didn't want to be photographed because they hid in the washroom, so we learned fast. And the Girl Guides came on a tour of the depot, and we had a magazine exchange. So we said to the Girl Guides after they toured and learned about recycling, and you can take a magazine home with you, and they all wanted to pick Playboy. So how do I explain to all these young Girl Guides, don't take Playboy, Mother wouldn't like it. Better take Maclean's or Time. But then we had Expo 67 was a lovely time, but soon after that the separatists reared their ugly heads. And we were uneasy because there were bombs in the mailboxes, there was a murder, there were threats to our school system, and it just was no longer comfortable being in Montreal, even though we had loved our life there. And so Garth applied to be transferred back to his hometown, Vancouver, and in 1973, we traveled across Canada by car. Oh, I've forgotten, my mother was still in Europe in 1950 and wasn't eligible to emigrate because she was 50 years old. And again, Mr. and Mrs. Simon sponsored her to give her a travel permit to come, and she was working in Montreal at McGill for 10 years. And I was working there for a while too after I was married to Garth and had to change jobs. Because husbands and wives didn't work in the same company in those days. So anyway, we all trekked across Canada and came to Vancouver, bought a house in Kerrisdale, and children went to school, Garth went to work, Mother did her own thing, and I was feeling very depressed and blue. Instead of a white, bright winter, Montreal winter, it was dark, and the day we moved into our house, it began to rain, and rained for a month. I wish we had some of that now. So anyway, a neighbor came along and said to me, let's go to United Players, there's a play on at the moment, it'll make you feel better. She was an ex-Montrealer too. And so she and I went to United Players and signed up with that theatre company on the spot, and I was a volunteer with them for 20 years, mostly backstage, but sometimes on stage. The other thing I got involved with was the university endowment lands, remember? There was a committee there to try to save it. It took us 10 years, different changes of government. We'd have to start from square one each time. And finally, we collected 60,000 signatures to save it as a park. And we presented it to Mr. Van der Zaan, who was in hot water at the time. You might remember the story of the Chinese lady with the many hats who gave him a brown paper bag full of money. And he needed 60,000 friends badly. So he put through that park, which is now the Pacific Spirit Park for all to enjoy. And I'm very proud of that. So when we moved to the West Van, we lived with our daughter Gwen and her husband in their house for a time, and then we got our own place. And of course the Unitarian Church, the North Shore Unitarian, I came to it here and got involved in my little small way, and this has been home base ever since. So now I have been in Canada, mostly peaceful Canada, for 67 years. Grateful to the Simons family, and now know the third generation of that family. And I enjoyed their generous spirit. And on Canada Day, I was proud to sing the Canadian anthem, Safe at Last. This is it. I have no time to tell you about the interesting people I have met in my lifetime. We'll leave that.